You're 6 years old and you just read a book meant for fourth graders. The adults in the room stop what they're doing and their voices pitch high with amazement as they ask if you really read the whole thing. When you nod and tell them what it was about, their faces change in a way you've seen before. When your cousin took her first steps, when your neighbor's kid hit a home run. But this is different and bigger. You got referred to as gifted, and from that moment, you're not just a child anymore. You're the smart kid. And that label feels like a crown at first. Special, chosen, superior. But crowns are heavy, especially on heads still learning to hold themselves upright. You didn't realize it yet, but you'd just been handed a life sentence. Your worth was now tied to your intelligence. Your identity became the one who knows things. Love and praise flowed when you performed intellectually, and they dried up when you didn't. The equation embedded itself in your developing psyche. Smart equaled good. Smart equaled loved. Smart equaled worthy of existing. Anything less than smart equaled disappearing. So you learned to perform. Not in the way children usually performed, seeking attention through antics or achievements. Your performance was more subtle and more exhausting. You performed intelligence itself. Every question became a test you couldn't afford to fail. When someone asked the capital of France at dinner, your 7-year-old heart raced. You knew this one. Paris, you announced. And there it was again, that look of approval. But what if you hadn't known? What if you'd said London by mistake? The fear crept in about whether they would still love you if you were wrong. This was how it started, not with dramatic pressure or harsh demands, just with praise that felt too good to lose. So you made sure you never lost it. You read everything. You listened to adult conversations, storing information like a computer. You developed a sixth sense for when someone was about to ask you to perform your intelligence. And you always delivered. But here's what no one told you about being labeled gifted. The gift came with terms and conditions. You had to always be the smartest in the room. You had to never struggle visibly. You had to make it look effortless. Because if you showed effort, confusion, or failure, then maybe you weren't gifted after all. Maybe you were just ordinary. And ordinary, you'd learned, was the worst thing you could be. By middle school, your identity has crystallized. You are your grades. You are your test scores. You are the speed with which you understand new concepts. When the teacher hands back tests face down, yours is always face up, because they say there's no point hiding it when you always get hundreds anyway. But they don't see you in the bathroom before every exam, hands shaking. They don't know you stayed up until 3 a.m., not because you needed to study, but because you needed to be sure. Sure that you wouldn't disappoint. Sure that you wouldn't expose yourself as a fraud. Sure that tomorrow you'd still be the smart kid. This is the psychological prison of the gifted child. Your entire sense of self depends on continuous intellectual performance. But intelligence is supposed to be natural, inborn, effortless. So you learned to hide your work. You lied about studying. You said you didn't even open the book when someone asked how you aced the test. Inside, you were exhausted from the 4 hours you spent memorizing every detail. But admitting effort would have meant admitting you weren't naturally brilliant. And that would have meant you weren't who everyone thought you were. The imposter syndrome started younger than anyone realized. When your identity was gifted, every moment of struggle felt like evidence that you'd been lying all along. That math problem that took you 20 minutes instead of 5 became proof you were a fraud. That essay you had to revise 3 times became evidence you weren't as smart as they thought. That B+ in chemistry felt like the beginning of the end. You developed coping mechanisms that looked like personality traits. You became the one who always knew the answer but never raised their hand first, because what if you were wrong? You became the one who deflected with humor when challenged intellectually, because what if they discovered you didn't know everything? You became the one who chose subjects you knew you'd excel in, because what if you tried something new and failed? The cage got smaller every year. Your world narrowed to only the areas where you could maintain the illusion of effortless brilliance. When people suggested you try art, you said you weren't creative. When they invited you to play sports, you claimed you weren't athletic. When someone mentioned learning an instrument, you insisted you didn't have the ear for it. But the truth was simpler and sadder. You weren't bad at these things. You were terrified of being bad at anything. Because being bad at something meant not being smart at it. And not being smart meant not being worthy of love. The other kids called you Einstein or walking encyclopedia. They copied your homework. They partnered with you for projects because you guaranteed an A. But they didn't invite you to parties. They didn't tell you their secrets. They didn't see you as quite human, because humans struggled. Humans failed. Humans asked for help. And you'd never been allowed to be human. You'd only been allowed to be the smart kid. Look forward 15 years. You were sitting in a meeting when someone asked a question you didn't know the answer to. The familiar panic rose, the same one from second grade when you couldn't spell rhythm in the spelling bee. "I'll need to look into that," you said, and the words tasted like failure. That night, you spent 3 hours researching the topic, crafting a 2 a.m. email with your findings, adding, "I wanted to double-check the latest data," so it seemed like you knew all along. This was your life. Every interaction a test, every meeting a performance, every mistake triggering a spiral that took days to escape. You were first in the office, last to leave. Not from love of work, but from fear of losing your edge. You volunteered for the complex projects where you could showcase intelligence, but underneath, you were exhausted. Not just tired, but soul depleted from constant performance. Relationships suffered in ways you didn't understand. Partners said you were emotionally unavailable, treating conversations like debates to win. You intellectualized feelings instead of feeling them. When they said, "I love you," you analyzed what love meant instead of saying it back. Friends found you exhausting, correcting their facts, turning game nights into competitions, making them feel stupid for having simple problems. The imposter syndrome from childhood had evolved into something complex. Now you needed to be every kind of smart. Tech smart, business smart, emotionally smart. You took endless courses, read productivity books like scripture, optimized everything. But one critical review could spiral you for months. One moment of not knowing could reduce you to that scared 6-year-old, wondering if love was conditional on having the right answer. The breaking point came differently for everyone. Maybe it was a panic attack during a presentation. Maybe a relationship that ended because you couldn't stop performing long enough to be vulnerable. Maybe realizing you'd spent 30 years in a prison built from other people's praise. The healing began with a terrifying admission. You were more than your intelligence. Your worth existed separately from your ability to know things. You started small, taking pottery classes and making lopsided bowls, joining activities where intelligence offered no advantage. You noticed the world didn't end when you were mediocre. The harder work happened professionally. You practiced saying, "I don't know," without immediately fixing it. When unfamiliar topics arose, instead of nodding and Googling later, you said, "Tell me about that." People actually enjoyed explaining things. Not being the expert made you more human, not less valuable. You learned that being smart was something you were, not something to prove daily. Intelligence existed whether you demonstrated it or not. The 6-year-old labeled gifted didn't know they were signing up for lifetime performance anxiety. They just knew adults seemed happy when they knew things. That child deserved to finally rest, to know they were loved for existing. You were a child who happened to be smart, not a smart thing pretending to be human.